power is largely attributed to the efforts of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, who was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy in 1956, a position he would hold for nearly 3 decades. In the midst of a Soviet military mindset focused on land power, Gorshkov managed to create a vision of a Soviet fleet that could advance Soviet strategic objectives and challenge the United States as a global sea power. He was quoted in Time magazine in 1968 boasting that the flag of the Soviet Navy now proudly flies over the oceans of the world. Submarines were central to Soviet naval strategy owing largely to Soviet geography. While Gorshkov advocated a more balanced fleet, he nonetheless oversaw the largest submarine construction program in history, including significant advances in Soviet submarine technology, arguing for a strategy of peace through strength that was intended to bankrupt the Soviet Union through military competition. Between 1980 and 1985, the number of dollars devoted each year to defense more than doubled from $142.6 billion to $286.8 billion. The Reagan administration spent more than $1.5 trillion on defense, forcing the Soviet Union to compete in a way that hastened the eventual downfall of the Soviet Union, although historians disagree over the degree to which the buildup was responsible. One response to the U.S. buildup was to increase the Soviet ballistic missile submarine presence by rushing deployment. Now Soviet submarines, many already using outdated technology, were sent on more deployments with less downtime, increasing the risk of accident due to a reduced maintenance and training schedule. The Naval class, which NATO designated the Yankee 1, began service in 1967. They're the first Soviet ballistic missile submarines to carry missiles with thermonuclear warheads with a yield comparable to the Polaris missiles used by American and British ballistic missile submarines. With a length of 420 feet and a displacement of 11,500 tons submerged, the Yankee 1 carried 16 ballistic missiles in the hull, as well as mounting 6 torpedo tubes. With a standard crew of 114, the submarine's 2 nuclear pressurized water reactors provided the boat with light, heat, water, fresh air, and of course propulsion that allowed a top speed of 28 knots. Commissioned December 31, 1971, the K-219 was old technology by the time she put to sea in September of 1986. One of Gorshkov's good-enough submarines sent to man the so-called patrol box east of Bermuda. The decade-and-a-half-old K-219 had already been the victim of an accident that underlined the risks of submarine warfare. The R-27 submarine-launched ballistic missiles that the Naval-class submarines carried was, unlike their Polaris counterparts, liquid-fueled. They used what is called a hypergolic combination, where a fuel, in this case unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, is combined with an oxidizer, nitrogen tetroxide, to produce ignition. Hypergolic fuels have the advantage of being easily and reliably ignited without requiring an outside source like a spark plug. But the downside is that the chemicals involved are extremely dangerous, being both poisonous and corrosive, and of course, explosive if they come in contact just a few years after the ship had been commissioned. A small leak in the seal in the vessel's number 16 silo had allowed seawater to drip in, where it combined with residual nitrogen tetroxide to form powerful nitric acid that had melted to a hydrazine line, causing an explosion and killing a sailor. The silo had been too damaged to repair, and silo number 16 of the K-219 was permanently welded shut, reducing her missile complement to 15. Not only was he on an unfamiliar boat, but the crew had been shuffled. 11 of the vessel's 31 staff officers, including the executive officer, and 16 of 38 non-commissioned officers had been replaced and were not operating with their normal crew. On an unfamiliar, aging boat whose maintenance time had been shortened, Britnoff was sailing with a crew not used to working with each other. After 30 days at sea on October 3rd, K-219 moved into its designated patrol area in the Sargasso Sea in the North Atlantic, when an engineer in the forward missile compartment discovered water dripping from under the plug of missile tube number 6, the third tube from the bow on the port side. The dripping soon turned into a stream of seawater. The captain had the boat taken to a shallower depth while an attempt was made to pump the water out. The cloud of brown corrosive oxidant started coming from under the missile. The captain declared an accident alert that included damage control measures like hermetically sealing all compartments. The crew's quick work likely saved the boat, as 5 minutes later the submarine was rocked by an explosion in missile tube number 6. Then, suddenly, a new crisis. The heat alarm started going off in the reactor room. The fires and corrosion had eaten through the systems that powered the cooling systems. If the reactors overheated, the rods would melt straight through the boat and release a cloud of radioactive steam worse than the accident at Chernobyl that would blow over the British overseas territory. A Lieutenant N.N. Belikov and Seaman S.A. Preminen volunteered for the assignment. The radiation suits they had were completely insufficient, and the compartment was over 180 degrees. They managed to manually lower 2 of the baffles in 2 trips, but Belikov collapsed from heat exhaustion. 20-year-old sailor Sergei Preminen made the 3rd trip alone, lowering the baffle that prevented, perhaps, the worst nuclear disaster in the history of the world. By the time he was done, the pressure between the two compartments had become so different that the door could not be opened, despite desperate attempts to force it. Preminin died of heat exhaustion and asphyxiation inside the reactor.